And we're back to the man who kind of got me into Warhammer. I suspect that he's going to talk about the tabletop aspect of Warhammer, which I'm not too familiar with. So I think it'd be interesting to learn more about it.
I must say the support on my prior Warhammer video has been, to put it lightly,
well-deserved.
Absolutely outstanding. I've not had a video perform that well in maybe 3 to 4 years, and it's also a breath of fresh air to be able to make a video on something on a whim, on Warhammer, a, while very popular game, not a game that I ever really made videos on, and to have it perform as well as it does. You know, YouTube and the YouTube world doesn't like change very much, so it is...
Oh my god. Yeah, I feel this a lot. I mean, sometimes you upload something experimental and it pops off, and then you gain like a whole new audience, which, funnily enough, Warhammer was kind of that for us. Earlier on, SCP was that series for us. And of course, we still love doing all of them because it's just things that we're interested in. But yeah, the YouTube algorithm and whatnot, you kind of have to sacrifice some things for it. An arm, a leg. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. You never really know.
Incredibly heartwarming. But with that, it also came with a question that was always being asked to me ever since making that video. Hey Bricky,
how do I start?
What army should I play? So for this, my next major Warhammer video, I'm going to answer that question.
So cool.
I'm going to go over all the different kinds of armies, just like we went with the main video, except instead of lore, we're going to be going through the different various ways of collecting the army, as in not only price-wise, but how many models you're going to need, how new or old the model scopes are, and we're going to be going over the play styles of each army respectively. Are they melee? Are they shooting? Are they a little bit of both? Elite armies with only 20 models on the battlefield, or horde armies with 120 models on the battlefield?
We're going
to be discussing all of those, what each army is about, and give you at least a decent run through of every single faction to allow you to make the conscious and intelligent choice on which army you want to play if you want to get into the tabletop of Warhammer 40,000. But first, before we start, I need to show you something. So I own an absolute boatload of wall art all across my house I received from cons. And so when I was contacted by Displate to sponsor this video, it was like an immediate yes. Anyway, I wanted to show you the ones I got because Displate is the sponsor for this video. The first one is a wonderful one from the Coen brothers, No Country for Old Men. This is probably my favorite movie of all time because I am a messed up human being. I like the dark, depressing shit. However, this one, I love it. It's very simplistic and it shows off this simplistic poster art that I tend to enjoy a lot. Now, past that, I actually got one for my mother because she is a huge Stephen King fan. So I got this fantastic Pennywise one to go along with it. And the third one I got actually was from fellow YouTuber Vtuber. You may know him. He did Dark Souls content and From Software content in general. And he has, I can't show you it right now because I got the extra large version because I wanted the big one of his. It is a absolute like gorgeous
that looks
piece.
so
It's just
cool.
as nice looking in real life as I expected. Now, it come to my surprise that after I ordered 3 separate displays to go along with the sponsorship,
I do want to get into
I
Dark
immediately
Souls
received 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 extra ones.
Don't know
and
when,
then
but
changed.
I do plan
And I
to.
kind of start realizing why they wanted a Warhammer video so much. Orcs, 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 orcs. Gotta have orcs. Sisters of Battle. We'll be talking plenty about them today. Angels of Death in all their glory. More Angels of Death in all their glory. And a Drukhari. I don't know what this is. Is it an Archon? It might be an Archon. I don't play Drukhari, but
that's
obviously Dark Eldar. I know the spikes. I get the spikes. I love the fact that you can just slap it onto your wall with a magnet with no fuss, and especially for someone who was renting a place, and I know a lot of you have had those experiences with landlords where you try to hang up wall art, you put a nail into the wall, and they're like, oh,
don't you dare hammer into the wall.
Is that a 2mm hole I see right there? That's $300 out of your security deposit, kid.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Display, for sponsoring this video. I would highly recommend checking them out. They make absolutely fantastic stuff. So check them out. They're in the description. And let us continue with the video, starting off with a couple terminology we should learn before we actually get super deep into it. First things first, there's a thing called Forge World. Forge World is actually a lore thing with the Adeptus Mechanicus. However, what it is actually a partner to Games Workshop. Forge World makes these kind of custom minis that aren't in the codexes specifically.
I never knew that. I see. So that's why they're called Forge Worlds, because they literally make the models. Gotcha.
However, you can use them and field them in your games. They're just generally expensive, kind of a little bit weirder. They're a little bit more bizarre and sometimes like fan-made creations and such. But Forge World is like a side company of Games Workshop that makes Forge.
You guys have said
I might mention them a few times.
It's okay.
I want to go ahead and
like,
tell you
it's
about
not
that.
The
They're
best.
not used a ton, but they are something that you can use.
Times,
Next, I want to tell you about hitting numbers. So if I ever say something like, "Oh, this army hits on 3s or 4s or 5s," what I'm saying is if they hit on 3s, that means if you roll a d6 and you throw it out there, if you get a 3, 4, 5, or 6, anything 3 or higher, then you hit your shot. You've landed onto your target. If I say they hit on 4s, it's 4 and up. 5s, 5 and up, etc. And finally, we have things called stratagems. I'm going to mention those a few times. Stratagems are like special abilities you can use after having a pool of command points that you get for building your army, and you can kind of dole those out, these special abilities, stratagems, as you wish. You ever played Command and Conquer, Red Alert 3, or perhaps Kane's Wrath? My personal favorite was always Kane's Wrath. You know those little abilities on the side of the map? It's like those. Let's start off.
Okay. I mean, I can understand that. While I do love strategy games, I've never played any of the Command and Conquer or really any RTS games. So the Warhammer RTS games that we're going to be playing on the channel, like Dawn of War, and I guess Total War also counts in that genre too, are going to be like the first ever RTSs I've ever played. So it'll be interesting to see how I fare. I've always played turn-based because I just like to think my turns out, but sometimes you need a little spice in your life.
Off with the #1 best army you should collect for a new player.
Space
Marines. Yeah. Before we get into tactics, before we get into how they play, I want to remind you all of the most important rule, the golden rule of collecting Warhammer. You will always have a better time with the army whose lore you like and design you prefer. Always buy the army you think are the coolest. If you
this. I feel this from a different perspective. If you're playing a gacha game, waifu over meta. I guess 40k is also the same way, or Warhammer in general.
Like undead Egyptian space robots that have enslaved gods as weapons, buy the damn Necrons. I don't care if Necrons are S tier or F tier, buy the damn Necrons, okay? If you love Viking aesthetic and you love Space Marines, get the damn Space Wolves. I don't care if they're S tier or F tier, get the army that you love the lore and the design of first. Nothing sucks more than playing a meta army that some people might not even want to play you against because you're going super power gamer and having to paint and create an army that you don't like. Play the army you think is the coolest.
That's another aspect of this too, because you have to put in so much effort to draw or, well, paint your models and make them look good and maybe even have their own lore, so if it's not something that's you can really call your own, then there's going to be that disconnect.
Golden rule. Okay, Space Marines. So the poster boys of Warhammer are our first faction today, and I know when I said that the best army to collect, all the new players are like, oh god, not the Space Marines, the generic ones, and all the veteran players are going to say, oh god, not more Space Marine players I got to deal with, and the tournament players are already ready to hire a hitman to kill me. But I'm sorry, I know, I agree, Space Marines are, right now, but they really are the best army. If you are a new player, Space Marines are your best bet. They are the best army to collect if you are a new player, and let me tell you why.
Makes sense.
Number
with
one,
how popular
Space Marines
they
got
are.
all the lore. They got a monopoly on lore. They easily have the most fleshed out backgrounds of any of the characters or...
I mean, I guess this is understandable. I've seen comments talking about it, and I mentioned it in a few videos too. But, like, they're human. And so it makes it easier from the writing perspective to make a compelling story about them. And easier for viewers to maybe relate to them. Because, like, you're not really gonna fully understand the motivations of a Tyranid swarm, right? Although I'm sure that, well, I hope there is, like, books about the Tyranids, because I do want to learn more about them. And I guess there's also the Tau, which is in a somewhat similar situation, but a lot of people don't really like them for, you know, their own reasons. But it's impossible to like think of 40k and not think of a Space Marine.
Factions in Warhammer. Space Marines have the most books. Space Marines are a huge part of the Horus Heresy. Just Space Marines will always have the most, and they have the most depth to them. Number 2, Space Marines are very easy to paint, especially for new players.
That is another aspect that I didn't consider. With how intricate some of the models can get. Yeah, I see. I get it.
When you get Space Marines, you have a ton of variety of chapters, and they all have a ton variety of colors. And they're also pretty easy. Space Marines are also very large, or at least larger than normal, so their canvas size is much bigger. Smooth armor, much easier to paint, especially their vehicles. And the paint schemes are easy. Ultramarines, blue, White Scar, white, Imperial Fist, yellow, Salamanders, green. It's extreme.
I have a question for you guys. I am absolutely horrible when it comes to art. Like anything that I have to do with fine detail using my hands, I usually end up breaking things. So, for you guys who, I don't think all of you who enjoy 40k are like artists. So, what do you guys do? How do you guys fare? Is the process pretty easy? You just gotta get started, or maybe your first few models just aren't gonna look good. Is that just something you gotta accept? Or can you, like, you know, pay extra for actually like painted, pre-painted models? But then you wouldn't really get the feel of like having your own chapter, right? Your own chapter of Space Marines. This is just something that I would hesitate to do because of how bad I am at art, or drawing anything in general.
Extremely easy to paint Space Marines, and for a new player, I would highly recommend them for that specific part, because the painting and building is a massive part of this hobby. Number 3, Marines are always getting new models. They are always getting equal attention from Games Workshop. Even if they have just been updated, they will get updated again and again and again. And the Harlequins and Dark Eldar players are crying in a corner, but we don't care about them because I got a new Primaris Lieutenant and he's got a skull shield. I don't know. They're always getting new models, and while it might be a little excessive at times, they will always be updated, and your rules will always be changing, and therefore it keeps it very fresh if you're interested in playing them. Number 4, you have a vast amount of data sheets and units at your disposal. See, in a codex, you have a part after all the lore of it, after some of the keywords and art pieces and stuff, you have the data sheet section where it goes over all of your units and what they do and their stats and everything, their special rules and so on. And when you get to that spot, however many units an army has depends on, well, you know, how many pages of data sheets is it. Take the Adeptus Custodes. They have a very small amount of units, and their standard codex of data sheets is only 11 pages long.
But they're very strong.
Sisters of Battle, however, a little more medium force. They have 19 pages of data sheets. The Imperial Guard, they have a much larger amount of data sheets because they're such a large army. They have 39 pages of data sheets. Space Marines, 56.
What?
56 pages of data sheets for different kinds of
just the varieties?
It's a little bloated at times because of the amount of characters and stuff, but still, they are all over the place. Their variety is endless.
I thought the Guardsmen would have the most,
even more updated and added as time goes on. Which brings me to number 5, and the most important of them all. Space Marines use every phase of the game. See, in Warhammer,
here it is. Ooh. Okay, command, movement, psychic. Yeah, that's right, the psychic phase. I was like, psychic phase? There's a specific phase to use magic? I was kind of imagining it like a Yu-Gi-Oh! Turn phase or something like that. Probably works in a similar way.
There are phases in each turn. We're just getting into 9th edition, so we're getting something called the command phase soon, which is fine. But then we have the movement phase, psychic phase, shooting phase, the charge, fight, and then morale phase. Now, the last 3 are kind of all packed into one, if I'm being perfectly honest. But the main thing is that a lot of armies might utilize some of these phases a lot more often than expected. Grey Knights are very big in the psychic phase because they're all psychers, and so they really have a lot there. While Tau...
And I'm super excited to play, what was it? Chaos Gate. It looks a lot like XCOM, and I'm a huge XCOM fan. Plus, it features the Grey Knights, right? So yeah, I can't wait to stream that game.
don't have any psychers and they won't even use that phase, but they've got really damn good shooting. However, they don't have any melee, so they're not going to be using the charge phase. Whereas,
they have Gundams.
Say, Slaanesh demons will use the charge and psychic phase plenty, but they won't be doing any shooting of like any kind, pretty much. The Marines, they will use every single phase, and you can't get good at the game and get good at the phases unless you're able to use all of them. And that's where Space Marines really shine. You can play them however you want in any kind of role. See, if you are running, let's say, an Iron Hands or Imperial Fist army, these are both shooting-based armies. But you can still have good melee, where if you wanted to play a more melee-based army like Space Wolves or Blood Angels, you'd still have good shooting units. You could still do plenty in the shooting phase. That's the most important part. Space Marines will use every single phase, and they are very, very good at it. So that is the main 5 reasons why you should be playing, or at least you should try collecting Space Marines. And I know I don't need more Space Marines in tournaments, but it is the best decision. They're good to paint, they're good to collect, they're always getting updated, they got tons of units, they use every phase, and you can tailor them however you'd like. Plus, and this is kind of down the line, but eventually after playing them enough, you might understand which army you'd want to collect second. If you start collecting a little bit of Space Marines, you start realizing, oh wow, I really think I'd prefer having more models on the table, or I wish I had tougher models. Then you can go for Tyranids or then Adeptus Custodians. It helps you figure out your second army a lot better. If you're a new player, you want to get interested in it, just do this. Go online,
you just gotta learn how to play the game first.
Or check eBay, because there's tons of offhand Marine stuff on eBay. Get yourself a pack of intercessors or maybe a tactical squad. I'd say intercessors because they're more modern, they're newer and more meta, and they're bigger for better paint canvases. Put them together with some glue, get some paint on them, try them out, and try getting into the game that way. I think it'd be a pretty smart and a pretty solid idea to get someone new into the hobby, and Space Marines just really are one of the better choices right now. Okay, now that I'm done sucking as much Marine dick as your brain, let's move on to the rest of the armies. And my personal favorite army at the current moment, the Imperial Guard, or the Militare, is fucking the Imperial Guard. The Imperial Guard are my main army. They are what is known as a gunline horde army. Whereas Orcs and Tyranids have a horde army that has shooting, but it's more melee based, the Guard is going to be running 60 to 100 infantrymen, support walkers, artillery batteries, aircraft, drop troops, tanks, bigger tanks. The Guard is all about just blistering firepower. Now, however, the downside to this is that the Guard, while well-trained, are only 4-up well-trained. They hit on 4s, and they also do not have very good survivability. Guard stuff tends to be rather fragile. They very rarely have any special saves to keep them from taking any damage. Most of their stratagems aren't based around survivability, but in fact more firepower. Guard don't shoot amazing with their 4-up accuracy. They make up for that with just sheer amounts of numbers of shots. I don't care if my tank hits on 4s when I've got fucking 3 of them. If the Marines are like the pristine Swiss Army knife where they can do anything and they have a little tool for every situation, Guard are like a Swiss Army knife that's about 10 times as big and attached to a big wooden stick that you just beat the shit out of people with. Your units are squishy, they don't hit great, but you've got so many of them that you just take people out by drowning them in gunfire. As for collecting the Guard, it's a little bit of a mixed bag.
Aren't they a bit more expensive though?
They're a bit older than I'd like. I personally think that they could use a decent amount of updates.
Because they just have so many models.
They do get updated plenty rules-wise, but since they've got so many different kinds of units and so many Forge World options, a lot of them are a bit old and are showing their age. As for collecting them in the money side, they're pretty expensive. You're going for a horde army, so you're gonna have tons of models on the playing field. That being said, I still do love them. I love their lore and their design. I love the large swaths of infantry, and I personally think they are pretty fun, if maybe not the greatest army as a main army. The Adeptus.
Yeah, it's not really my preferred playstyle, but I can see the appeal of just going in, blowing shit up with as much firepower as you can.
Mechanicus are the war cult of Mars. They are very weird, and I've been over how weird they are plenty before, but they are probably one of the wackiest armies in the game, maybe along with Gene Stealer cults. The Adeptus Mechanicus have a lot of really weird back and forth styles when it comes to their gameplay.
So cool.
They're mainly a shooting army. I'd say they're about 75% shooting, 25% 100% melee. However, they do have a couple dedicated melee units that can hurt pretty bad, but they're much lower on the tier list compared to the amount of gunfire they can bring. They hit pretty well. They generally hit on 3, sometimes 4s, depending on if they're using mechs or their own current bionics. But they do definitely have some of the wackier stuff. The entire army has a 6-up invulnerability save, so occasionally you get some pretty clutch moments when you start taking damage and you roll a couple dice and you get a couple 6s and you can shrug off like full-on missiles and stuff. So that's pretty cool. One of their base weapons is a really regular, kind of crappy carbine, but if you roll a 6 for it, it does double damage, which can actually be ludicrously powerful at times. Then you've got the weird robots, the Castellan robots, that they're these giant like World War I mech dudes.
So we're also streaming Mechanicus currently, and there are 2 really big spots in places for where you can have your trash mobs or whatever, your troops. So yeah, these mechs are definitely one of the big ones that are going to show up later in the game. Haven't reached there yet, but yeah, excited to finally see them in action, if we ever survive to that point.
That have a refractor field, so if they block off shots with their, reflector invulnerable save, it'll launch back damage towards the enemy, which can be kind of crazy. They're very strange. They definitely are quite strange. Much more shooting over melee, and definitely fun, and has some great looking characters. Belisarius Call might be one of the best models in the entire game. Super cool looking too. Bitch to paint though. Oh my god. And that does lead me to the collecting of the AdMech part itself. They're actually getting a lot more newer updates lately. They're actually one of the newest armies as well. They came out only a couple years ago. All their stuff is in plastic and it looks really damn good. I personally think that they have some of the best aesthetics in the entire game. The only problem is that painting them is going to be a real bitch. I would recommend trying to do some of the simpler stuff, like maybe the Dune Crawler, before you get into things like Call or a Tech Priest Dominus, because wow, is painting that going to be really damn hard. Cost-wise, they are getting a bunch of new units, which is great, but generally when you get new units, they're very expensive, and whenever new stuff comes out, it tends to be a bit expensive. The army isn't a horde, but it's also not an elite army, so they're probably in the mid-ground when it comes to price range. However, I would recommend them to people who like some kind of wacky antics and some weird abilities and weaponry, because AdMech has been getting better and better as time goes on, and they're pretty dang cool to collect. So mid-tier price, maybe a little bit more expensive, but their scopes look great and they're very new, and I would highly recommend them. Next up, you've got the Adepta Sororitas, or also known as the Sisters of Battle.
The Sisters of Battle have army, though a lot of style.
Be honest, they are really coming up to overtaking the Imperial Guard. I love my Guard, I love my Cadians, I love my Tempesta Scions, but the Sisters of Battle, they're really cool. Not only from a lore perspective, they're just insanely religious, zealotous nuns. That already is just really dang cool. As for the tabletop, they're one of the closest range armies in the entire game that isn't a full-on melee army. They're a slow-moving, like advancing gunline army with some actually horrifying melee units and just some ridiculous close-range firepower. The Sisters are probably one of the top 3 hardest armies to play, I'd say. They've got some really weird antics as well, kind of like AdMech, maybe not quite as wacky. This army can be played in almost any way as well. You can do this a full gunline army or a full melee army, or 50-50. Everything is viable. They do require a lot of finesse and manipulation, because these are all low toughness sisters that do have good armor, but when you've got a low toughness like they do, and they're not necessarily the most powerful when it comes to the actual punching, they can actually be shot off pretty quickly. So you need to be really smart on how you maneuver them, because you've got a super short range, kind of squishy army at times. That can be a little bit challenging to get through.
I'm assuming toughness has to do with like strength as well as maybe just HP, whereas armor is a separate thing that you can maybe use to like deflect or mitigate damage. So ultimately, while you have good armor, if your toughness is low, that means you would probably die more easily than, like, say, a Space Marine whose toughness, I'm sure, is quite high. I'm not familiar with every single terminology from the tabletop game, so I'm just guessing from context here.
That being said, people are sleeping on the power of sisters. let me be the first one to say it, you are all sleeping on how strong this army is. This army, if played well by a smart person, will crush you. As for the actual collecting of the models, Sisters are the most recent army, at least as the time of making this video, who have had a
should be pretty easy to find, right?
Army overhaul. For a while, there were no plastic sister
Hmm.
models whatsoever, but the entire army, besides I think one unit, got a full overhaul of models. Everything is brand spanking new, and they probably have the best looking models in the entire game, in my opinion. They look incredible. That crazy gothic, kind of Catholic nun look. I mean, come on, their tank is a pipe organ missile launcher. It's a pipe organ missile launcher.
Pretty funny.
Sisters are one of the coolest looking armies in the entire game. They are a bit expensive though. That's the one downside, is that because this entire...
Is there anything that's not expensive that comes from Games Workshop? And I mean, yeah, sure. There might be some starter kits or whatever that would seem pretty cheap to you guys, but like $5 is a lot to me. So like seeing something that's like $80, I think, was some of the prices that I saw. It's like, yeah, no, I need to eat.
Their army is brand new. It is brand new with a brand new price tag. So I personally love them. They might soon become my favorite army. I can't quite tell yet. They look great. They're a little expensive to collect. They have lots of different kinds of abilities, both melee and shooting. No psychic phase, but they do have some shenanigans to stop other people from using the psychic phase. They're pretty cool, but they are really hard to play.
Makes
and
sense.
They take a lot of practice. So kind of up to you. I would say not a very good starting army, but they are pretty neat. All right, Grey Knights. I heard you like the psychic phase. If you like the psychic phase, this is the psychic phase for you. Grey Knights are Space Marines X2. They're super mega duper elite Space Marines that are all psychers. They're nuts. Grey Knights are insane. They are very, very elite. However, you have probably like 40% fewer models than an average army will have. All of your dudes, however, are scary in their own right. They all hit very well on 3s minimum. They all have great armor. Since they're all psychers, they're really good at dealing with other psychers. They also have great shooting and very strong melee. All of your guys have extremely powerful melee weapons. The only downside to Grey Knights is that any anti-psyker shenanigans can really harm them, and you are running an elite army with very few models. When you run very few models, that means every time you're rolling and you roll those ones, it hurts that much more.
I see it. I see it. And when you lose a unit, it's much more devastating than, well, whenever the guardsmen lose one of their units. And there's also that trade-off, right? You're a psyker, so you're better at fighting other psychers, but they're also better at fighting you, and anti-psyker units are way better at killing you, so... Still, though, they're just so cool. I don't know, there's something about them. I really enjoy them. I don't know anything about them. I haven't even done a video on the Grey Knights yet. Am I stupid? What am I doing? I've just been diving into fantasy. But yeah, I mean, eventually we'll get around to the Imperium of Man, and I'll learn more about them and see some of their named characters. I'm sure I'll pick up a lot of lore once I play Chaos Gate, though.
Grey Knights, though, they have this awesome kind of old school knight round table aesthetic with them all carrying things like halberds and falchions. They've got holy text, and they carry books around and flags. But they do get to use every phase as well. Lots of psychic, and then they're shooting and a ton of melee as well. Mainly psychic and melee. In terms of buying them, they're not too bad, actually. They're probably one of the cheaper armies as well. Because when you're running an elite army, not as many models on the tabletop, so it's a lot easier to fill out your entire army by only purchasing many or fewer boxes than normal. As for their scopes, I don't know exactly how new they are. I wouldn't call them very new. I call them like middle ground when it comes to how old they are. They're not super old, but they're not necessarily super new either. That being said, if they are, say, medium old or whatever, they do look great. I love the way the plastic models look. I think they look fantastic, and I would recommend trying them out if you like a psyker-heavy Space Marine thing. You play Space Marines and you're like, wow, I like the psychic phase. Grey Knights. No competition. Infantry is for losers. It's big mech boy
The big boys.
If I'm being honest, though, the Imperial Knights, I wouldn't recommend them. I'm just going to come out and say it. I don't think Imperial Knights are a very good army for a new player. They are one of the cheapest armies you can buy because while each knight in its own right is very expensive, You only need 3 or 4
A few.
to fill out an entire game's worth.
Just 3 or 4?
And compare that to a full army. They're actually not too bad, like price-wise. The problem with Knights is that, as cool as they are, they will use the Psyche phase. They have plenty of shooting, though, plenty of shooting, and they can have some really great melee. But when you're playing Imperial Knights, you're not really playing 40k. A great friend of mine said, if you're playing Imperial Knights, you're playing chess, but you have about 6 queens against a normal enemy chess player. If the enemy chess player is smart, they could easily beat your 6 queens. I'm sure it'll be pretty simple for them to use their full arsenal to beat you. But if the enemy chess player is a noob, for instance, then there's a good chance that they're not going to be able to win, and you'll just kind of noob stomp them. And that's what Knights are.
Crusher?
Knights are generally noob stompers, or more like just a middle tier army. They're not good for new players because they don't really teach you the game, and it's not the way the game is really, I don't know how to say it, meant to be played.
I mean, I guess once again, this is just the appeal of like the simple armies, right? Like, yeah, you're probably going to lose against an experienced player, but you don't have to think too much. You just shoot them. And they have to think about how they're going to fight against you instead. But yeah, I think it's great that obviously there's different options and different gameplay styles. Personally, whenever I play games, I like to play as tanks and pretty much anything that has simple mechanics, because I'm just not good at it. But simple but effective, and is able to do many different things, though, is kind of the caveat of that. Whereas what Bricky is describing here isn't exactly that,
so to speak. I got nothing against Knight players. If you're a Knight player, it's totally fine. If you run a Knight Valiant, you have nothing but my respect, all right? Get that Knight Valiant, 2-up armor, 4-up invul, Trader's Pyre. Oh, wait, you can't have both. Just have Trader's Pyre, the coolest weapon in the game. All right, but honestly, just for a new player, I would not recommend Knights. They are cool. They're great painting projects, however. If you just want to paint something, definitely pick up a Knight.
Yeah, they do look cool.
Great. You're not really playing 40k when you play Knights. You're playing kind of a weird hybrid of it. If anything, get a normal army, like say Imperial Guard or maybe some Space Marines, and then buy one big Knight and throw it into your army as an ally. That would be the way to do it, I'd say. I think they're better.
Oh yeah, I suppose that system does make sense, but I wonder how you'd have to like balance out your own units. Would that be like, oh, in order to put this knight in, you gotta remove like 3 Space Marines or something like that? There's probably some ruling for it, but I do think it would look much cooler if there was like one big knight in surrounded by an army of Space Marines rather than just 3 or 4 of them.
Better as a supplementary character as opposed to a main army or force. This is also same for Chaos Knights as well. They do look really cool, though. They do look really cool.
Yeah,
Golden Boys. Adeptus Custodians
are
the elite of the elite. This is probably one of the most elite armies you could possibly play. These guys are nuts. They hit on 2s or higher in shooting and melee. They have triple the health of a normal Space Marine. They have a better armor save than a normal Space Marine. They all have invulnerable refractor fields around them, which most armies do not have. They're tougher than Marines. They get to reroll 1s in the shooting and melee phase when a certain captain is near them, which means they're hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s. You absolutely murder people in melee. You've got some okay shooting. Your shooting is hit or miss, but your melee is insane, and you use about 20 models. They are literally the definition of Chad Thundercock, okay? Chad Thundercock, if that was a human being, it would be a custodian, okay? The problem is that you only have 15, 20, 25 models in your entire army. It is absolutely crazy how powerful these guys are, but they do pay the price for it. That being said, when it comes to collecting them, they are one of the cheapest armies you can buy because they're so elite.
You lose 1/20th of your entire army.
Things to purchase, you don't need as many models to have on the field. So buying custodians is much cheaper than your average army. It's an elite army, and also they're much easier to paint, in my opinion, because they're so big, because they're like 2 feet taller than a Space Marine, lots of a big canvas for your painting, and they're almost all gold. Gold isn't that hard to paint, I wouldn't say. So they're good for painting. They're not very expensive. I would say they're not bad at beginner army, if I'm being honest. They're pretty cool. They have a nice kind of power fantasy to them, but as an elite army, every one you roll, it's gonna really hurt. So that's something you should be worried about. or warned about at least. They are pretty neat though. I'm not going to touch on the Assassins, Sisters of Silence, or Inquisition too much because they're not really an actual army. The Assassins are really damn cool. There's 4 of them and you get to pick one to add to your army
like an ally
as you see fit.
right?
They all have different things they do and specialize in. A sniper, a horde clear, a kind of confusion specialist, and an anti-psyker character. Cool, their scopes are really nice, and since they're only single characters, not too expensive, but you really can't make an army out of them. They're more of a supplementary character. The Sisters of Silence just recently got an update to allow you to field them with custodians, which is awesome and super cool, and is actually kind of a big part of them because the Sisters of Silence are big anti-psyker, but they only have maybe 2 kits, 3 kits in their entire army, and that's about it. They're not really worth collecting in their own right unless you're already collecting custodians. And the Inquisition are a whole bunch of just little characters, basically.
Yeah, just
a whole bunch of named characters with the cool abilities, which are neat, but not really something that I would try to get a whole bunch of. Look at all 3 of those things after you're already starting collecting another army, and you're like, hey, I kind of want an assassin. Throw an assassin in there. Unless you're playing custodians, then check out the Sisters of Silence because the custodian's biggest weakness is psychic, and the sisters do a great job at cutting that down. All right, let's move on to Chaos.
Very good.
So we got the Chaos Demons to start off with. Chaos Demons follow one of 4 gods: Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, or Slaanesh Big Titty. With Slaanesh Big Titty, you're going for melee and fast. You are all melee, you've got no shooting, you got good psychic spells, but you're running in there at Mach 5. Papa Nurgle is slow,
very
but tanky as hell. Tzeentch, a little bit in between, but tons of psychic spells. Khorne, no psychic, melee, hits like a truck. Pretty much all of the Chaos Demon factions are glass cannons and very heavy into melee. You got some good psychers for about 3 of the 4, because Khorne I don't think has any.
Wings.
So there is still plenty of variety in there, but what you're doing is you got a whole bunch of big glass cannon demons that run up and just break your face. That's Chaos Demons in a nutshell. They all have their various traits. Slaanesh is fast and hits a lot of times. Nurgle is tanky. Tzeentch is psyker. Khorne hits really hard. Pretty simple in that sense. But overall, Chaos Demons, to collect them, they're not something you would really collect by themselves. You would ally them in with things like Chaos Space Marines, which we're going to be talking about in just a moment. But as an army in their own right, don't try to make a demon army, I wouldn't say. They don't teach you a ton of the game, and they're a little bit limited because you have to stick with one Chaos faction normally. If you want to ally in multiple things, you're probably going to need some Chaos Space Marines to go along with it. And with that, let's talk about that. Chaos Space Marines, you're kind of getting the butt end of Games Workshop. They don't really seem to like you, Chaos, that much. I don't know why. A lot of your models aren't very new, and a lot of them are expensive, and your rules aren't that great most of the time, with the exception of something that happened in 7th edition with Chaos Demons, apparently. I heard it was a very, very strong codex. Chaos Space Marines are very similar to regular Space Marines, but they're much more focused on melee combats. You still have shooting, and it depends on which faction you're going through as well. But while you do have your shooting units, it is generally more melee-based, I'd say. Demons in their own right, and Chaos in their own right, want to run in there and start breaking face. That's generally their MO. As for Chaos Space Marines, it depends on what legion you're joining, but overall, there are a ton of different ways for you to go ahead and get about completing your objective. The Death Guard and the Thousand Suns, I believe, are the most fleshed out. They both have their own codexes. They both have their own special units, especially Death Guard. Death Guard is very recent, and both of them allow you to field a Primarch, which might be one of the coolest parts about them. You can run Mortarion or Magnus the Red. Both gigantic, beautiful models that are just awesome showpieces to have. They get shot a lot, but once they get into combat, oh man, do they cause problems.
I mean, like, even if you don't play or like compete in the Warhammer tabletop, just like having one of these models fully painted and displayed somewhere in your room, like in a case, maybe, it just looks good.
As stated before, you should be building what you'd like, of course. What you enjoy is the most important part of it. But as for Chaos, it's really, you gotta like melee combat, and you gotta like different kinds of allying, probably. I'd say Demons aren't, not Demons, but Chaos in general, isn't a great faction to start off with as a new player, because you need to understand the intricacies of how to do army building and knowing what you're running a little bit more prevalently.
I see.
And so I'd wait on doing anything Chaos related, at least until they get a solid installed updates, or someone teaches you, or you get a little more into the hobby. With the exception of Death Guard. I think Death Guard is in a good place for a new player, because Death Guard is pretty cool. But besides that, they're a little tough. Okay, let's talk about some Xenos, starting off with the Space Elves, the Eldar. So the Eldar are definitely a more glass cannon-y kind of style group. They are the first Xenos race we're talking about, and there are a couple versions. There's also the Drukhari and the Harlequins. However, the Eldar, they are strike hard, strike fast, and get out of there immediately. So the thing about Eldars, what would happen is they would fly out of somewhere, immediately gun down with extremely high power weaponry, hitting on threes with some kind of BS stratagems, if I'm being honest, and then they can zip back into cover and really annoy you. Honestly, Eldar probably have some of the more powerful shenanigans when it comes to the game. They have lots of weird rules. Their stuff hits extremely hard, but of course, once you fire back at them, if you live, they will crumble under a slight breeze.
If you live, then you hit, yeah.
If you play Eldar, you won't be making a bunch of friends, if I'm being honest. I'd say Eldar are top 3 most aggravating enemies to fight against. People don't like fighting Eldar a whole lot. Myself included, I find them to be quite aggravating. But if you're that kind of person who likes zip in, zip out, and be all kind of trickery and sneaky, they're definitely the army for you. They're definitely more shooting and psychic based. That's the 2 main things. They've got some good melee, but mainly shooting and psychic based. As for collecting Craft World Eldar, I'd say that they got some good sculpts. Some of their models look pretty good. They got some nice plastic. A few of it's a little bit older, but you don't need a huge army. So when it comes to the money side of it, not too bad. I'd say the financials for it are pretty dang solid.
I mean, just looking at the models that have been showcased here, I'm not really feeling the Craft World Eldar too much, nor the gameplay style. It's really not me. But I am kind of curious as to like how hard their weaponry hits. Is there like some sort of BS where you can do like double damage with a particular stratagem or something? Because I remember, I think the orcs have something like that, right? They hit on like 5s or something, but if they do hit, they get to roll again to double their damage. It's been a really long time since we watched the Factions Explained video, and I read that comment, but I think there's something like that for the orcs. Maybe something similar for the Eldar, but obviously a lot more reliable.
And I wouldn't call them an expensive army to collect, at least not from my knowledge. The Dark Eldar, or the Drukhari, are like Eldar cranked up to 12. They're faster, they can hit harder at some points, and they have really good melee units. Their melee units can actually be really scary, but they are also doubly made of paper.
Yeah.
They're also a lot harder to play. They're probably top 3 hardest armies to play, along with the Sisters of Battle. And that actually goes on to the Harlequins as well. Harlequins are an army that just don't collect Harlequins, if I'm being honest. They're not a great choice. They have barely any models, and they're really weird, and they have a lot of shenanigans if you want to pull them off. If you're a new player, I would not recommend Harlequins at all. Dark Eldar, and Harlequins, speedy, made of paper, hit like absolute trucks, and not too expensive, I wouldn't say. Drukhari, I think, is a little bit more expensive than the other 2, but not too pricey because you don't field a ton of units in your armies. Moving on, we got Tyranids, bugs. Yeah, got bugs. You gotta love those bugs. So many bugs.
Lots of
Tyranids obviously are a horde army. Should be very obvious. They are also a melee horde army. Whoa, I know, call the presses. You are mainly spending your time in the melee phase, as well as some of the psychic phase. You got a lot of good psychers in the Tyranids army.
Oh, really?
Enough. You've got some pretty involved and advanced bugs. And your melee phase is as it seems. You have really gigantic, gargantuan creatures that eat everything alive, or you've got 40,000 little boys that eat everything alive. You do actually have some somewhat good shooting too with your Exocrine and your Hive Guard. You can put out some pretty decent shots. They are definitely the kind of army you run if you want big swaths of just these angry little running bug dudes that just swarm on your enemy. It's literally called the Tyranid Swarm. As for price-wise though, I'd say they're actually very, very expensive to collect. Their scopes some are a little bit older, but not all of them. They're a little bit in between when it comes to the actual date release for their scopes. I'd say they are a bit older, though they are expensive. They're expensive, and you're running a horde army, so it's definitely one of the top more expensive armies to collect because, come on, tons of bugs, tons of models, and older scopes. Can be a little bit of a challenge. Gene Stealer Colts. You want to play bugs, but you want to play human bugs with scrotum heads. Gene Stealer Colts are a very new addition. Very, very new. And they run in this almost as weird as AdMech style army. They're very fast, they hit really hard, and they like dip underground, they cross underground, they hit you with very powerful short-range weaponry.
So it makes sense why they're
super strong melee attack, and then they kind of run away and they like zip, hit and run tactics. That's probably the best way to do it. Hit and run tactics, they come out of the ground, they spook you, they do a bunch of damage, they run away, they got some weird psychic spells here and there, they run these like makeshift Mad Max trucks and stuff. They definitely have a unique play style. They deploy strangely, they like to zip around the place kind of strangely, and they definitely are one of the more unique armies there are. Would I recommend collecting them? No. They kind of fulfill a niche, but they're not that like overarchingly special, I'd say. I don't know what the word is exactly, but they are a very specific play style for a very specific player. If you're running Tyranids, you might consider doing Gene Stealer Colts, but at that point, you already kind of know what you're doing, so I don't think I recommend this to a new player. Gene Stealer Colts and Tyranids both a little bit rough to recommend to a new person because they are very expensive, both of them. And while the models for Gene Stealer Colts are definitely a lot newer and that's much nicer, they need practice. They are definitely a harder army, and I would recommend waiting on those if you're a new player.
Any Gene Stealer Cult players watching the video? Maybe you guys can, I guess, elaborate on how your faction works. Because from what Bricky has said, it's just kind of very specific and hard to describe. So I can't really get a good picture on it. I guess it's just maybe one of those things you got to try for yourself or like see somebody in action play it to really understand it. But yeah, orc time.
Orcs. Now, orcs. I would say orcs are great if you like the Horde army and you like having RNG dictate your life. So orcs hit on 5s, as I mentioned in my last video. However, if you roll a 6, you get to make another attack with the weapon. Everything from the little pistol to the giant rocket launcher. You can have a rocket launcher that fires 3 times, and if you get lucky enough, you can have it fire 5 times. But the main thing that you're probably going to be jumping with orcs for is the giant green tide, because their melee ability is pretty humongous. They have very weird gunfire. They got their weird weapons and their strange rules, the daka rules to allow them to get all these extra shots. And they can even have some pretty dang good shooting with things like shock attack guns and daka jets and stuff. If orcs hit on 5s and shooting, they hit on like 3s in melee. Orcs love to beat the hell out of each other. So it's very obvious that once they get into melee, they'll just start pounding on you because they are really good at hitting stuff. In fact, I might be speaking a little bit too hyperbolically when I say RNG controls your life with orcs. Or RNG controls your shooting, but your melee is actually pretty dang good. They've got a special ability called Here We Go, which allows them to re-roll their charge dice, which is a very rare thing and extremely powerful buff. Getting into melee has never been easier if you're an orc. As for collecting dice,
I'm gonna assume you roll in order to figure out how far you move forward, because charge dice, that's the only thing I can think of.
Orcs, expensive. Probably the most expensive Horde army there is. Probably more expensive than Tyranids or Guard or anything in between. They have scopes that are sometimes new, sometimes very old. You can have cool new models like Gaskell Thraka, but then you got a whole bunch of really damn old orc models because orcs have been around forever.
I think Gaskell's like the leader of the orcs.
Pretty neat, and there's some pretty good models in there, but orcs just,
could be
they're showing their age, and you need a shitload of them. And they are very expensive for that reason. So they're expensive to collect, and you need a ton to collect a good-sized army. But playing them, if you like melee with some really fun shenanigans and a bit of RNG, I can see why someone would like orcs, because they're orcs. Come on, they're great. Let's talk Necrons. So the Necrons, if I had to pick a Xenos army, I'd play Necrons, honestly. Necrons, I mean, they're just so cool. Undead, Egyptian skeleton robots that carry enslaved gods into battle. How is that the coolest thing ever? So Necrons are fittingly named blah blah necromancy, but not like the undead homina necromancy, but like necromancy through metal. So the way Necrons are is that they are kind of a slow moving, at least some of their units slow moving, gun line with some mixed in melee units.
They look
not
so
all
cool.
Their army is melee, but their melee units that they have are actually like like really scary. But for a while, Necrons are kind of slow-moving Terminator style guys. They just blast you away at a distance with some very powerful weaponry. They kind of have Space Marine stat lines, actually. They run about as many models as Space Marines. They got similar stat lines and similar weaponry. I'd say that they're actually quite similar to Space Marines in the terms of how they play. But they actually do have a lot of weird shenanigans that make Necrons their own. For instance, the main thing that you might want to pick Necrons for is their reanimation protocols.
There it is.
Special ability that, let's say you got 10 units of your base Necron unit, warriors, for instance. You got 10 Necron warriors, your basic troop choice. Your opponent kills like, let's say 7. Kills 7 of them, you got 3 of them left. Their turn ends, your turn starts. You then roll a dice for every dead model. So 7 models, 7 dice. And for every 5 or higher, you automatically get one of your models to just stand right back up. Your Necron just goes like... Your vehicles regenerate health as time goes on. You have special abilities to maybe make your Necrons come back on a 4-up instead of a 5. You can re-roll your 1s for it. It's all about getting your units to come back up and being like, if you're fighting Necrons, you better kill it. Because if you leave it wounded, it's going to repair itself, and that's not a very good thing. That's the idea of Necrons. They got good shooting, they got good melee, really and honestly, now is a good time to be a Necron player. They are getting a massive update right now. This is right before 9th when this video is coming out, and they are getting huge new model ranges, a ton of just new units in general, massive updates, rule updates. Necrons are getting big additions, and I think it's going to be super great. Now is a good time to be a Necron player. The new stuff might be a little expensive to collect because it is new stuff. That being said, they're not an elite army, but I guess they can't be played an elite army if they wanted to, but they don't have a few models, they don't have too many models, they're nice in between, and now is a damn good time for it. Last but not least, we have the Tau Empire. The Tau Empire is for people who want to gun their opponent down with the most sci-fi hardcore Gundam giant mech stuff you can think of. You want to have your entire enemy obliterated off the board through just the unrelenting volley of railgun shots and rail rifles and fusion blasters. You will look up and you will see missiles, giant homing missiles blot out the sky as it rains down on your army because the Tau player...
much? I think Bricky also mentioned that, well, in a previous video, the Factions Explained one, people don't really like playing against a Tau because that's just their thing, right? They play ranged, they will beat you in ranged, they just have that much weaponry to beat you in ranged no matter what, so you kind of just have to play through it somehow. But I mean, it sounds fun to play as the Tau player. I don't know about playing against them.
He's got 40,000 missile pods on all of his characters. He's got flying drones to fire laser sights to mark them to have better accuracy, to block shots, and you know your big battle suit will be rolling up and then a drone will come in and block a missile from it. The Tau are definitely more of an Eastern inspired, definitely a Gundam kind of look to them.
Yeah.
And they are just ludicrously powerful in shooting phase. And they also have tons of special abilities to stop your opponent from getting to you in the charge phase. The Tau has no melee. Their melee is straight garbage. When a Tau infantry start punching, it means they've lost. And you might think to yourself, wow, Bricky, this sounds great and aggravating. Yep, that's about right. The Tau get a lot of shit. Some of it warranted, some of it not so warranted. The models in their own right definitely don't fit very well with 40k. They're much more of a sci-fi Gundam style thing compared to a gothic, grim, dark sci-fi fantasy. However, I do think they do look pretty cool in their own right. It's just kind of weird in this universe. But when you've got an entire army whose whole job is to blast you away from incredible ranges across the map, and every time you even try to retaliate, they either gun you down when you try to charge or they block your shots with drones, it can be pretty aggravating. That being said, there are really cool new ways to play Tau, like close range attacks with Cold Star battle suits in the Farsight Enclaves, which, by the way, if you ever use a Cold Star battle suit, or a Cold Star commander, I suppose, or a Yavara, you have my respect. So you do have different options when it comes to Tau instead of just sit back and fire. But you definitely don't got much melee. It's good to have different play styles. You definitely don't got much melee. You suck at melee. But if you just want to gun people down and the only phase you care about is the shooting phase, you don't care about psyche, you don't care about melee, you just want to blast people, Tau is definitely for you. As it comes for collecting them, their scopes are pretty good. They're not entirely super new, but they do look great. They have a whole bunch of different kinds of mechs, big and small. They got drones, big and small. They got infantry units and everything. They do look solid, high-tech, and their scopes do look nice. They're also, I'd say,
very
not
sci-fi.
too expensive. You don't need a ton of them, and the battle suits themselves are expensive for each box, but you only need so many of them because they are very expensive when it comes to the points cost in the game. So Tower on the middle level of the expensive tier.
Points cost, okay, I see. Maybe each faction, or maybe depending on the edition that you play, there's like a maximum point cost, and you can field units depending on the amount of point cost, and until you reach like near the limit or reach the maximum limit, which is how you would figure out whether you can like take out a few Space Marines to put in a knight or like an assassin or whatever. But I guess it would also call into question like is it balanced? Like, have we truly figured out that this particular unit being in this battle would be at around the same power level as this other unit? So we put it at this cost.
A lot of talking right there. That covers it though. That is every army in 40K for you trying to figure out which army you want to play. I will reiterate, Space Marines, they are the best. I know it kind of sucks for some of us, but trust me, they are the best. I would highly recommend if you're trying to get into it, get a box of Intercessors, check out the rules, paint them up maybe. 9th edition is coming very, very soon. It looks extremely promising, and I think now is probably the best time to be jumping into this hobby. I want more people to be a part of this community, to be a part of this fandom. I think it's exciting. I think it has a little something for everyone, and I don't want anyone at all to not feel welcomed, not on any basis, not on basis of age, sex, gender, race. I don't give a shit, okay? I don't care who you are. I want you to at least give it a shot and be a part of this group with me because I would always love new people. And honestly, there's no reason why you shouldn't have a good time along with the rest of us. So yeah, thank you so much for watching this video, everybody. It was a pleasure having you here.
Thank you very much, Bricky. That was a fantastic overview of the tabletop game. And of course, if you haven't already, go down to Bricky's video, give him a like, give him a sub. I'm gonna assume that most of you guys watching this already have, though. For me, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Necrons, and the Tyranids all seem pretty cool. I think I'd enjoy playing them. Maybe. Who knows? You kind of have to like see these things in action, or play them for yourself to really know. I still think I definitely like pick the Grey Knights. If I ever got into like the tabletop side of things, I'd pick the Grey Knights as my first army. I'm actually pretty curious to see an actual Warhammer tabletop battle in action. I might check that out on my own time though, because I don't really think it would make for great React content. So if you guys have any channels, actually I'm sure Bricky probably has some videos on that. Yeah, I might look at Bricky's channel later then to check some of that out. But yeah, thanks for watching. If you want to see more Warhammer, click on the playlist that has magically appeared on your screen. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.